The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the judge's desk, sending a sharp crack through the suffocating heat of the courtroom. Every eye in the crowded room stared directly at Sarah, dripping with dynamic, unvarnished malice. The wealthy wives of the Oakhaven Town Council sat in the front row, their silk fans fluttering like the wings of vultures. They whispered loudly behind gloved hands, throwing sharp, degrading insults at her full, voluptuous figure. Sarah stood completely alone at the defense table, her hands gripping the smooth, weathered pine wood so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the fabric of her faded calico dress straining against her wide hips and generous bosom. It was the only dress she owned, washed so many times the blue dye had faded to the color of a winter sky. "The charges brought by the town council are quite clear, Sarah Jones," Judge Miller boomed, his eyes narrowing with cold disgust.
You live alone, you operate an independent bakery without male supervision, and your provocative presence has disrupted the moral fabric of this community. A cruel laugh rippled through the gallery, led by the mayor's wife, who leaned forward just to look down her nose at Sarah's frame. Sarah bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to let them see a single tear fall down her face. She was just a cook, a woman who spent 16 hours a day sweating over a scorching stove to feed the local miners. Her crime wasn't immorality. Her crime was being a large, beautiful woman who refused to beg the town leaders for crumbs. Therefore, Judge Miller continued, raising his quill to sign the official parchment, this council sentences you to immediate asset seizure and permanent exile from the territory. A collective gasp of cruel satisfaction filled the air as the local deputy stepped forward, his hand reaching for Sarah's arm to drag her out into the dirt.
Before his fingers could even touch the frayed fabric of her sleeve, a massive, thunderous crash rattled the entire building. The heavy oak double doors of the courtroom didn't just open, they flew off their iron hinges and splintered against the wall. The mocking laughter instantly died, swallowed by a thick, suffocating silence that gripped every throat in the room. Silas Vance stood in the doorway, his tall, massive frame blocking out the midday sun like an oncoming storm. His leather duster was coated in gray trail dust, and a low-slung Colt revolver rested heavily against his thigh. He was the most feared, ruthless rancher in the entire state, a man who owned 3/4 of the valley and answered to no law but his own. His dark eyes, cold and sharp as chipped flint, scanned the room before locking directly onto Sarah's trembling form. Silas strode down the center aisle, his heavy spurs ringing out against the floorboards with a slow, terrifying rhythm. The crowd parted before him like water, people knocking over chairs just to get out of the shadow of his broad shoulders. He didn't look at the judge, nor did he acknowledge the trembling mayor who suddenly looked like a cornered rabbit. Silas stopped right beside Sarah, his massive presence instantly shielding her from the hostile stares of the entire town. He reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy, bulging leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of solid gold. With a brutal, careless swing, Silas slammed the pouch onto the judge's desk, cracking the polished wood right down the center. "This sham of a court is officially over," Silas said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. Judge Miller swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of pale as he looked at the wealth on his desk. "Mr. Vance, you cannot simply disrupt a legal exile," the judge stammered, his hand shaking.
The woman has no protector, no standing. Silas leaned forward, his face inches from the judge's, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. Before we reveal the shocking words he whispered next that changed Sarah's life forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of this epic story. Silas rested his large hand on the grip of his pistol, his eyes burning into the judge. "She has a protector now," Silas growled, his voice carrying to every dark corner of the room. "She is not leaving this territory, because as of this morning, she is my wife, and everything I own belongs to her." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of hushed whispers and sharp gasps, the fans of the wealthy wives fluttering in a panicked frenzy. The mayor's wife choked on her own breath,
her face turning an ugly shade of crimson as she stared at Silas Vance. Sarah looked up at the massive man standing beside her breath catching in her throat as her heart hammered against her ribs. She could see the sharp line of his jaw, darkened by a thick layer of rough stubble that added to his menacing aura. Silas did not look at her, keeping his piercing gaze locked entirely on the trembling judge, his hands still resting heavily on the gold. "Your wife?" Judge Miller whispered, the paper in his hand shaking so violently that the ink began to smear. "We have no record of a marriage license, Mr. Vance, and the law requires—" "The law requires you to shut your mouth and take the gold," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. He leaned in closer, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow that completely swallowed the judge's elevated desk. "My personal chaplain signed the papers at sunrise, and if you want to contest my word, we can settle it in the street right now." The judge quickly dropped his quill, his hand snatching the heavy pouch of gold and shoving it beneath his desk before anyone else could touch it. "Case dismissed," Miller croaked out, his voice squeaking as he slammed his gavel down one final time to end the circus. Silas turned his back on the court, completely ignoring the outraged glares and the bitter muttering of the town councilman. He looked down at Sarah, his gaze softening just a fraction as his eyes traced the soft, full curves of her face and body. Without a single word, he reached out his large, calloused hand, presenting his palm to her in front of the entire stunned audience. Sarah hesitated for a single second, looking at his rough skin before slowly placing her trembling hand into his massive grip. His fingers closed around hers with an incredible, reassuring warmth, pulling her gently toward the splintered exit of the building. As they walked down the center aisle, the townspeople shrank back into their seats, terrified to even breathe too loudly near Silas. Yet as Sarah passed the front row, she caught the low, venomous whisper of Mrs. Albright, the town banker's cruel wife. "He only took her because no respectable woman would ever have him. A fat, penniless cook from the gutters." The words cut deep, slicing through Sarah's fragile composure and reminding her of the agonizing reality she had lived for years. For 3 long years, she had survived in Oakhaven on nothing but sheer willpower and the meager pennies she made from her baking. She remembered the freezing winter nights spent in the drafty back room of the bakery, wrapped in a single, hole-riddled blanket. She remembered the local merchants deliberately raising the price of lard and flour whenever she walked into their stores, laughing at her struggle. They called her a drain on the community, a woman whose heavy frame and independent nature didn't fit their narrow, righteous ideals. Many nights, Sarah had sat by her cooling oven, weeping silently as she counted the final 3 cents left in her leather purse. She had endured the mockery of the local men, who made crude jokes about her large hips when they thought she couldn't hear them. She had tolerated the deliberate loneliness, accepting that her voluptuous body made her an outcast in a town built on fake modesty. Now, as the hot afternoon sun hit her face outside the courtroom, she realized she was leaving that miserable life behind forever. But the bitter taste of their rejection still burned in her throat, a heavy weight that her new husband could clearly sense. Silas led her straight to a massive custom-built black wagon hitched to 4 powerful midnight black stallions. He placed his hands around her waist, his strong grip effortlessly lifting her heavy, full figure up onto the high leather passenger seat. Sarah gasped at his effortless strength, her face flushing crimson as she settled onto the soft, luxurious cushion. Silas climbed up beside her, grabbing the thick leather reins with his gloved hands and snapping them against the horses' backs. The wagon surged forward, kicking up a massive cloud of Oakhaven dust that completely blinded the townspeople watching from the porch. As they tore out of the settlement, Sarah looked back one last time at the fading buildings, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and fear. She was safe from their exile, but she was now bound to the most dangerous man on the frontier, entering a world she knew absolutely nothing about.
The black wagon rattled over the rocky terrain, leaving the suffocating borders of Oakhaven far behind in a cloud of gray dust.
Sarah kept her eyes glued to her lap, her fingers nervously twisting the faded blue fabric of her calico skirt. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thud of horse hooves and the creak of the leather harness. She stole a glance at Silas out of the corner of her eye, watching the steady, unyielding way he held the reins. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, his dark eyes focused entirely on the winding trail that led up into the jagged hills. Sarah's mind raced back to 48 hours ago, to the stormy night that had changed the course of her miserable life. She had been cleaning the flour dust off her bakery counters when the back door was nearly kicked off its hinges. Silas Vance had stood there, drenched to the bone, his usual terrifying composure completely shattered by raw panic. His 6-year-old daughter, Clara, was burning alive with a sudden, vicious frontier fever, and the town doctor had refused to ride out in the torrential mud. Without a second thought, Sarah had grabbed her satchel of dried willow bark, wild elderberry, and the heavy iron pots she used for brewing remedies. She had walked 3 miles through the howling wind and deep pulling mud, her heavy frame aching with every grueling step. For 2 straight days, Sarah never closed her eyes, sitting by the little girl's bedside while the storm raged outside the grand ranch house. She used her own strength to lift the child, gently cooling her skin with damp cloths and coaxing the bitter herbal tea down her throat. Silas had watched from the shadows of the room, his chest tight as he saw how tenderly this large, exhausted woman cared for his only child. On the second morning, the fever finally broke, and Clara opened her eyes with a soft smile, reaching out to hug Sarah's neck. As Sarah wiped the sweat from her own forehead, she had collapsed onto a chair, her voluptuous body trembling from sheer physical depletion.
Silas had stepped forward then, his massive hand resting gently on her shoulder, his voice low and solemn as he thanked her. But their quiet victory was cut short when a ranch hand rode in with the news of the town council's emergency trial to exile her. Silas hadn't hesitated. He had ordered his men to saddle the horses and prepare the marriage papers before the sun could fully rise. Now, sitting in his wagon as his legal wife, Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and finally found her voice. "Why did you do it, Mr. Vance?" she whispered, her voice cracking slightly in the dry afternoon air. "You didn't have to ruin your reputation by tying your name to a woman like me, a woman they call a disgrace." Silas didn't answer right away, his hands tightening on the leather reins as the horses climbed a steep ridge. He pulled the wagon to a halt at the crest of the hill, overlooking a massive, breathtaking valley that stretched for miles. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity that made her breath catch. "The people in that town are fools, Sarah," Silas said, his deep baritone cutting through the quiet mountain air. "They see your strength and your beauty as a threat because their own lives are small, bitter, and hollow." He reached out, his rough, leather-gloved thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from her damp cheek. "You saved my daughter's life when this whole valley turned its back on us, and I protect what is mine." He pointed his whip toward the sprawling green pastures, the massive timber house, and the thousands of cattle roaming below. "Welcome to the Vance Empire, Sarah," he said softly, his gaze lingering on her full, generous lips. "This is your sanctuary now." The massive iron gates of the Vance Ranch groaned open as the black wagon rolled under a towering timber archway. Sarah looked up in awe at the sprawling estate, which resembled a fortress built from heavy stone and polished cedar logs. Dozens of rough-faced ranch hands stopped their work, pulling off their wide-brimmed hats in respectful silence as Silas drove past. Silas brought the powerful black horses to a smooth halt right in front of the grand 2-story main house. He climbed down from the driver's seat and walked around to Sarah's side, extending his arms to lift her down. Sarah felt her face grow hot as his large, strong hands securely gripped her wide waist, lifting her full frame effortlessly. He set her down gently on the solid porch steps, his hands lingering on her hips for a split second before he stepped back. The heavy front door swung open, and little Clara came running out, her face bright with health and her curls bouncing. "Sarah, you're back!" the little girl cried, throwing her small arms around Sarah's plush, comforting waist. Sarah instantly knelt down, wrapping her arms around the child, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Silas watched the two of them, a rare, genuine smile softening the harsh, weathered lines of his rugged face. An elderly housekeeper stepped onto the porch, bowing her head respectfully toward Sarah with genuine kindness in her eyes. "Mrs. Vance, your quarters have been prepared, and Mr. Vance has ordered a hot bath for you immediately," she said softly. Hearing herself addressed by that title made Sarah's breath hitch, a strange mixture of pride and anxiety fluttering in her chest. Silas stepped up beside her, his massive shoulder brushing against hers as he looked down at his new wife. "Go inside, rest, and wash the dust of that wretched town off your skin, Sarah," Silas murmured, his voice low and intimate. "You are safe here, and nobody will ever demand anything from you again without your absolute consent." Sarah nodded, letting Clara take her hand and lead her into the cool, luxurious interior of the massive timber mansion. The master bedroom was grander than anything she had ever seen, featuring a massive plush bed and a roaring stone fireplace. A large copper tub stood in the corner, filled to the brim with steaming water that smelled of fresh lavender and pine. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah soaked her aching body without worrying about the cost of firewood or water. She washed the dirt from her skin, her fingers tracing the lush, soft curves of her body that the town had so heavily condemned. As she dried herself off, she noticed a beautifully wrapped package sitting on the velvet armchair near the bed. Attached to the package was a small piece of heavy parchment with Silas's strong, bold handwriting scrawled across it. "A proper greeting for the queen of this ranch," the note read, making Sarah's heart hammer against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she untied the silk ribbon and peeled back the crisp white paper to reveal what lay inside. Resting in the box was a breathtaking nightgown made of the finest, heavy cream silk she had ever laid her eyes upon. She slid the smooth, luxurious fabric over her head, gasping as it flowed effortlessly over her wide hips and generous chest. It didn't constrict her or hide her frame. Instead, it hugged her ample curves in a way that made her feel incredibly powerful. Later that evening, a soft knock sounded at the heavy oak door, and Silas stepped inside, having changed into a clean, dark shirt. He stopped dead in his tracks when his eyes landed on her, his dark gaze darkening with a sudden, intense heat. His eyes traced the elegant sweep of her full figure, the way the cream silk shimmered against her warm, smooth skin. Sarah instinctively tried to pull the fabric together to hide herself, her old insecurities screaming in the back of her mind. "Don't," Silas commanded softly, his voice dropping into a deep, gravelly register that made her body shiver. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just inches away from her as the firelight danced over them. "You are the most beautiful sight I have ever seen in my life, Sarah," he whispered, his eyes locked onto hers. "Tomorrow, the whole valley will learn what happens to those who dare to disrespect the woman I cherish." By noon the next morning, the dust of Oakhaven was stirred up by the arrival of a luxury coach from the city. Silas had sent a rider out at midnight, summoning the most expensive, high-end tailor in the entire state directly to the ranch. 3 large trunks filled with rolls of heavy French silk, dark midnight velvet, and delicate lace were carried into the grand parlor. Sarah stood nervously in the center of the room, her heart pounding as the tailor ran a measuring tape around her full figure. She braced herself for the usual mocking sighs, but Silas sat in a leather armchair nearby, his dark eyes watching every movement. "Every gown will be cut to honor her shape," Silas ordered, his voice cutting through the room like a crack of a whip. "If a single seam pinches her or tries to hide her curves, I will throw you and your trunks off my land." The tailor nodded rapidly, his hands shaking as he adjusted the rich, deep crimson velvet against Sarah's generous hips. For the first time in her life,
Sarah looked into a full-length mirror and didn't see an outcast. She saw a striking, breathtaking woman. The heavy, structured velvet hugged her wide waist and flowed over her ample bosom like water, making her look absolutely royal. While the tailor worked, Silas stepped out onto the porch, where his foreman was waiting with a stack of financial ledgers. "The town council thinks they can survive without us," the foreman reported, spitting a stream of tobacco into the dirt. "Mayor Albright and the banker just approved a new tariff on any goods coming out of our Northern Valley pastures." A cold, ruthless smile spread across Silas's rugged face, his eyes narrowing as he gripped the wooden porch railing. "They want to fight. We will starve them out," Silas growled, his deep voice carrying a terrifying weight of finality. "Call in every single mortgage held by Vance Holdings on the town businesses, effective by tomorrow morning at dawn. Stop all cattle shipments to the Oak Haven slaughterhouse and reroute our supply trains directly to the capital instead. Let's see how much the mayor's wife enjoys her fancy tea when her husband doesn't have a single cent left to his name." Within 48 hours, the sudden, brutal financial stranglehold hit the town of Oak Haven like a devastating summer drought. The local bank doors remained locked as panicked merchants realized their credit lines had been completely cut off by Silas.
The butcher shop ran out of meat, and the grand dry goods store could no longer source flour or sugar without Vance shipping lines. The very same councilmen who had proudly voted to exile Sarah were now huddled in the mayor's office, sweating through their suits. They realized too late that by trying to destroy a penniless cook, they had awakened the wrath of the valley's true master. The desperate situation in Oak Haven reached a boiling point on the 5th evening of the silent, crushing embargo. Desperate to break the financial chokehold, Mayor Albright and the corrupt council members resorted to a final, cowardly scheme. Under the cover of a moonless night, the mayor's brother and 2 hired thugs snuck onto the northern borders of the Vance ranch. They carried a leather satchel packed with forged documents, intending to bury them near Silas's perimeter to frame Sarah for grand theft. They believed that if they could brand her a criminal in the eyes of the federal marshal, Silas would be forced to abandon her. But the Vance Empire was not a place where men could walk unseen, and Silas's scouts had tracked their horses from the moment they left town. Sarah stood by the parlor window, her heart dropping into her stomach as she saw a dozen armed ranch hands mount their horses. Silas stood at the front of the line, his face illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange glow of a kerosene lantern. He checked the cylinder of his heavy Colt revolver, the sharp metallic clicks echoing through the quiet, tense night air. Sarah rushed out onto the porch, her long velvet nightgown sweeping over the wooden planks as she reached out for his leather sleeve. "Silas, please, don't risk your life for this," she pleaded, her voice trembling with raw, unadulterated fear for his safety. "They want to destroy me, not you." "I can take my things and disappear into the night if it means keeping you and Clara safe." Silas stopped, turning his massive frame toward her, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive fury that made her gasp. He stepped close, his large, calloused hands coming up to cradle her face, his thumbs gently wiping away a stray tear. "You are my wife, Sarah, and nobody takes what is mine," he growled, his deep baritone vibrating against her skin. "I spent my entire life building an empire so that the woman I love would never have to run from cowards again." He leaned down and kissed her with a deep, consuming passion that left her breathless, sealing his vow in the quiet darkness. With a sharp whistle, Silas swung himself up into the saddle of his midnight black stallion and tore into the night, leading his men. 3 miles away, near the winding creek that marked the property line, the 3 conspirators were on their knees, digging in the mud. Before they could even bury the satchel, a wall of thundering hooves surrounded them, kicking up a blinding storm of dirt and gravel. Silas pulled his horse to a brutal halt right in front of the mayor's brother, his revolver already drawn and leveled at the man's chest. "Looking for something, Albright?" Silas whispered, his voice deadlier than the cold steel of the barrel reflecting the starlight. The thugs dropped their shovels, their hands flying into the air as the Vance ranch hands cocked their rifles with terrifying synchronization.
Silas dismounted slowly, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel as he picked up the leather satchel and inspected the forged papers. He didn't call for the sheriff. He didn't wait for a legal trial that he knew could be bought and twisted by the town's elite. Instead, Silas delivered the brutal, unforgiving justice of the frontier, using the heavy wooden stock of a rifle to shatter their resolve.
He forced the broken, bleeding men back onto their horses, binding their hands tightly behind their backs with rough hemp rope. "Tell the mayor that his time is up," Silas ordered, his eyes narrowing into slits as he looked toward the distant lights of Oakhaven. "Tomorrow morning, the bill for my wife's tears comes due, and every single one of you will pay in full." The annual territory gala in the center of Oakhaven was usually a display of arrogance for the town's wealthy elite. Tonight, the grand town hall was filled with a tense, suffocating silence as bankrupt merchants and sweating councilmen stood around empty banquet tables. Suddenly, the heavy double doors were thrown wide open, and the crowd gasped as Silas Vance stepped into the light. On his arm was Sarah, looking absolutely magnificent in her custom-made midnight blue velvet gown that proudly showcased her gorgeous, full-figured beauty.
The heavy fabric hugged her wide, voluptuous hips and generous curves, while diamonds sparkled in her hair, reflecting the glowing chandeliers. She walked with her head held high, her old insecurities completely vanquished by the absolute adoration burning in her husband's eyes. Silas led her straight to the center stage, his heavy boots echoing like thunder as the remaining councilmen shrank back in terror. He pulled out a new, legally binding federal deed and slammed it onto the main podium for the entire town to see. "As of tonight, I have bought every single mortgage, business line, and acre of land in Oakhaven," Silas announced, his voice booming through the hall. "The Vance Empire now owns this town, and I am naming my wife, Sarah Vance, the absolute co-owner and true queen of this territory." Mayor Albright fell to his knees, his hands trembling as his arrogant wife began to weep openly, realizing they were completely ruined. Silas looked down at them with cold disgust, his arm wrapping possessively around Sarah's waist as she smiled with ultimate triumph. "If you want to keep your homes, you will drop to your knees right now and beg my wife for her forgiveness," Silas growled. One by one, the wealthy wives and corrupt leaders who had mocked her size fell to the floor, weeping and begging the beautiful woman they had tried to exile. Sarah looked down at her former tormentors, feeling nothing but peace and the fierce protective warmth of the man who loved every inch of her. "Now, we want to know what you think. Would you have forgiven the townspeople after achieving such an incredible victory, or would you have exiled them just like they tried to do to Sarah? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories from the frontier.